During the 1980s, Arnold Schwarzenegger starred in 10 films. 6 of them were box office successes, 1 was a flop, and the remaining 3 were disappointments for Arnold. They didn't break even in theaters, but calling them failures would be unfair, as they quickly turned a profit through home video and TV sales. For one of these films, Arnold was paid only $2 million, a relatively low salary for him at the time, and it wasn't his fault. It was the price he had to pay for his freedom from a multi-film contract. The situation with the other 2 films was more complicated. Arnold earned record-breaking fees for them, so the studios expected huge box office numbers. But things didn't go as planned. Today, let's talk about one of these films. The Running Man is generally considered a fairly average film. For Arnold, it was a step back in his career. Of course, The Running Man is far from being a masterpiece of world cinema. There's no point in denying that. But for its time, it was still a decent movie, and it could have been even better if not for all the problems it faced during production. The film is based on a novel by Richard Bachman, who is also known as Stephen King. The story behind King's pseudonym is well known. He wanted to see whether his success was just luck or if he truly had extraordinary talent. So, in an effort to prove himself, he adopted this pen name, created a backstory for it, and released several books. Many of them became bestsellers, convincing King that his success had nothing to do with luck. The producer of The Running Man, Rob Cohen, claimed that when he bought the rights to the novel's film adaptation, he had no idea Richard Bachman was Stephen King. Later, when the producers discovered the truth, they actively used King's name in the film's advertising campaign. In the early stages of development, The Running Man was much closer to the original novel. Patrick Swayze was supposed to play the lead role. At the time, Red Dawn had just come out, and many studios were eager to cast him in their projects. Swayze considered the producers' offers and read the script. According to the official version, he took too long to decide, and everyone simply got tired of waiting for him. As a result, the filmmakers moved on, and Swayze ended up taking the lead in Dirty Dancing. Ironically, he also could have played the lead in Total Recall. Around this time, Arnold Schwarzenegger joined The Running Man. After the failure of Red Sonja and the lukewarm reception of Raw Deal, he was searching for projects that could revive his career. Those projects turned out to be The Running Man and Predator. Initially, George Cosmatos was hired to direct The Running Man, the same George Cosmatos who had helped Sylvester Stallone direct Rambo: First Blood Part 2. The Running Man was supposed to be his next project. Cosmatos proposed drastically changing the existing script, setting most of the movie inside a massive shopping mall. After that, Arnold would escape into the woods, and the film would gradually turn into Rambo. The producers and director even traveled to Edmonton, Canada, to scout locations, visiting what was then the world's largest shopping mall. That's where they abandoned the idea. Most likely, The Running Man couldn't afford such an ambitious scale. At the time, the film's budget was expected to be around $17 to $18 million, with $5 million going to Schwarzenegger. Cosmatos' vision would have required about $27 million. As a result, he left the project and went on to help Stallone with Cobra. After that, the filmmakers turned to Alex Cox, known for Sid and Nancy. However, after reviewing the material, Cox opted to direct the smaller Walker instead. He was open to working on The Running Man, but the producers didn't want to wait for him, fearing they might lose Arnold in the process. With Cox out, the offer to direct The Running Man went to Carl Schenkel. The producers negotiated with him for over 2 weeks, but nothing came of it. They also considered Ferdinand Fairfax, who wanted to give the film a Monty Python feel. Ultimately, though, they settled on Andrew Davis. Davis had just finished Code of Silence, one of Chuck Norris's highest-grossing and most famous films. Because of that, many wanted him to direct their projects, and working with him seemed like a great opportunity. With Davis in charge, The Running Man finally went into production. 2 weeks later, Andrew Davis was fired. The reasons were clear. He was going over budget and moving at an incredibly slow pace. After 2 weeks of filming, he had only completed what should have taken 1. He was also a perfectionist, forcing Arnold to redo the same scenes over and over again. As for the budget overruns, accounts differ. Some sources claim that in just 2 weeks, Davis burned through $8 million while producing only a week's worth of footage. The total budget was $17 million for a 2-month shoot, with $5 million reserved for Arnold. That left about $4 million for the remaining 7 weeks of filming. It's hard to imagine what $8 million could have been spent on so quickly in 1987. In reality, Davis was filming scenes with Sub-Zero and the motorcycles. Some of the footage he shot before being fired made it into the final film. Arnold later said that firing Davis was a big mistake. According to him, that's when the film took a wrong turn and lost many dramatic scenes that helped flesh out its vision of the future. But this realization only came later, after the movie failed to perform well and faced criticism. Although Arnold wasn't yet a full-fledged superstar at the time, he already had a lot of influence. Producer Rob Cohen said that if Arnold had opposed Davis's firing, the producers wouldn't have been able to let him go. They would have had to find another solution, but they convinced Schwarzenegger that keeping Davis in charge could turn the film into a disaster, so he didn't intervene. According to screenwriter Stephen E. D'Souza and producer Rob Cohen, Davis had a chance to stay on board despite the budget overruns, but they didn't like his footage of the Sub-Zero fight. Plus, they thought some of his ideas were ridiculous. For example, he wanted Arnold's character to keep Sub-Zero's puck and use it to blow up a group of enemies who cornered him at the very end of the film. They felt this was a terrible idea because it made the main character look stupid. Between the Sub-Zero fight and the finale, he would have had plenty of opportunities to use the puck. Holding on to it until the very last moment made no sense. Years later, in 1994, screenwriter Stephen E. D'Souza, now working as a director, would go on to end the stellar career of a famous Belgian actor. Meanwhile, Rob Cohen, after becoming a director himself, would bring us Dragonheart and The Fast and the Furious, forever redefining the meaning of family. Davis later said that when he was fired, he thought his career was over. No one wants to hire a director who gets fired at the start of their career. He was saved by Steven Seagal, who was a big fan of Code of Silence and invited Davis to direct Above the Law. Davis held no grudges against Arnold. He said they had a good relationship and that he knew Arnold had defended him to the producers. This seems to be true because years later, Arnold invited Davis to direct Collateral Damage, which ended up being another spectacular box office failure. As for the producers of The Running Man, they were desperate to find a director who could take over the troubled project and finish it quickly without asking too many questions. The new director was Paul Michael Glaser, recommended by Michael Mann. Glaser had worked with Mann on the TV series Miami Vice and knew how to work fast as television production demands. Arnold later heavily criticized Glaser's work. He believed the film didn't turn out the way it was intended, largely because Glaser was still transitioning from television to feature films. Arnold didn't like how the director focused too much on the TV show elements and ignored the more serious themes in the script. However, Arnold repeatedly emphasized that the main problem was likely the fact that Paul Michael Glaser joined the project at the last minute and simply didn't have enough time to properly read the script. According to Schwarzenegger, as a result, The Running Man ended up looking like a typical TV production. In television, it was common practice to hire directors just a week before filming and force them to shoot on the fly without any preparation. Naturally, with all these delays and reshoots, the film could no longer fit within its planned budget. During production, the filmmakers often ran out of money and had to scramble to make ends meet. For example, they bought the helicopter footage from the producers of King Kong because they couldn't afford to film the scenes themselves. As a result, those scenes looked rather cheap, even by the standards of the time. Producer George Linder was even forced to sell his wheelchair manufacturing company to cover costs. The Running Man went way over budget, and the filmmakers had no idea where to find the extra millions they needed. The original $17 million project ended up costing $27 million, and if the claims about Andrew Davis blowing through $8 million in 2 weeks are true, then excluding Arnold's fee, The Running Man was really more of a $14 to $15 million movie. With that budget, they could have actually made George Cosmatos' version with the giant shopping mall and Rambo-style jungle action. That version might have avoided many of the film's problems. In a later interview, D'Souza admitted that they didn't really like Glazer as a director, and that he was definitely not an improvement over Andrew Davis. But Glazer had one major advantage. He never fell behind schedule. Interestingly, the actor who received the most praise for his work in The Running Man was Richard Dawson, who played Damon Killian. Dawson had been the longtime host of Family Feud, and many people who had worked with him on the show said that his performance in The Running Man wasn't acting at all. He was just playing himself. That's exactly how he treated his subordinates on Family Feud. Dawson and Arnold were great friends in real life, and it was only because of Arnold that he agreed to appear in the film. The Running Man was Richard Dawson's last movie. After that, he never acted again. The Running Man was originally supposed to hit theaters in June 1987, a perfect release window for a sci-fi film. Its only major competition would have been Beverly Hills Cop 2, which had been scheduled for release 4 weeks earlier. But Arnold Schwarzenegger, more specifically 20th Century Fox, disrupted those plans. A few months after The Running Man's release date was set, Fox scheduled Predator for the same time frame. The big problem? The Running Man was an independent film, meaning it had no chance of competing with a major Hollywood studio's marketing power. It seems that all of Arnold's box office failures in the 1980s were independent films. Raw Deal, Red Sonja, and The Running Man were all funded by private investors. Perhaps this also played a role in their underwhelming box office performances. In any case, The Running Man's release was hastily pushed back to mid-November 1987. Many believe this move significantly hurt the film's earnings. Late November is when audiences in the U.S. usually go to see family-friendly movies, making an R-rated action film a tough sell. And yet, The Running Man had a solid opening at the box office. When it debuted, it dethroned Fatal Attraction, which had dominated the U.S. box office for 8 consecutive weeks. However, just 1 week later, the box office was flooded with family films. Teen Wolf 2 and a re-release of Cinderella hit theaters. The week after that, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and 3 Men and a Baby were released. The Running Man's $38 million box office total wasn't bad. If the budget had stayed within the original $17 to $18 million range, it would have been considered a success. But with a bloated $27 million budget, it wasn't enough to break even. Of course, The Running Man also had international earnings, but since the film was sold to local distributors, exact figures remain unknown. Judging by the audience numbers, its overseas performance was modest at best. Stephen King doesn't like this film. First, because it has almost nothing in common with his novel. Second, because he hated the casting of Arnold in the lead role. He wanted Patrick Swayze instead. Director Paul Michael Glazer's film career never really took off. Meanwhile, the fired Andrew Davis went on to direct The Fugitive, Under Siege, and A Perfect Murder in the 1990s. As for Glazer, he attempted a few small films in the mid-90s, but after 2 back-to-back comedy flops, he returned to television where he still works today. Nowadays, The Running Man is appreciated more than it was at the time of its release. Many of its once futuristic concepts don't seem so far-fetched anymore. According to audience ratings, it's considered weaker than Predator, Commando, or The Terminator, but in this case, weaker doesn't mean bad. Arnold just has too many cult classics and something had to rank lower. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.